For me, Hanukkah isn't about the light that burned for 8 days and nights. In the historical texts I've perused, I don't find a direct reference to the miracle of the lights, although there is mention of a determination by the Assembly of Israel at the time that every year at that season, in the days of dedication should be observed with gladness and joy for 8 days, beginning on the 25th day of the month of Kislev. Rather, to me, the miracle is the light that burned in the hearts of the men and women who would rather die than profane the name of our God. I say our God because he is the same today as he was then. Now, dear audience, I ask that you let your imagination paint you a picture from the poor foundation my words can supply. It will still be over 300 years before the birth of Yeshua. Alexander the Great has conquered most of the known world, but now the shadow of death has drawn a veil across his face, and he gathers his generals to him, knowing the time of his end draws nigh.
To whom shall your kingdom be left, my king?
To the strongest.
Years pass as the generals compete to see who is the strongest, dividing the kingdom by strength of arms and right of conquest, until Antiochus has taken control of the lands of Judea among the rest of his territories. His son, Antiochus Epiphanes, a root of evil, rises to power in the 137th year of the Empire of Greece, having been a hostage in Rome. At this time, evil men arise within Israel and convince many of their brethren to make a covenant with the Gentiles around them, claiming that, since we separated from them, many evils have come upon us. So, in honor of the covenant, many of the Jews agree to build a gymnasium in Jerusalem, remove the marks of circumcision, and abandon the holy covenant. Thus, they join themselves with the Gentiles and sell themselves to do evil. After invading Egypt and defeating Ptolemy, Antiochus returns to Jerusalem in the 143rd year and sacks the temple. Arrogantly, he enters the sanctuary, plunders everything of value, commits acts of murder, and speaks with great arrogance, and then returns to his own land, leaving this land a desolation of mourning. And it is said, Israel mourned deeply in every community. Rulers and elders groaned. Maidens and young men became faint. The beauty of women faded. Every bridegroom took up the lament. She who sat in the bridal chamber was mourning. Even the land shook for its inhabitants, and all the house of Jacob was clothed in shame. 2 years pass, and Antiochus sends a tribute collector, accompanied by a large force of troops. Speaking words of deceit, he addresses them peacefully. But no sooner are they convinced he comes in peace than the troops fall upon the city and slay many of the people. Plundering the city, they burn it with fire, tear down the houses and walls, and take captive the women, men, and cattle. With that accomplished, they make Bethlehem their citadel, well fortified and supplied. Stationing lawless and sinful men there, it becomes a snare, an ambush, and an adversary to the people. The people of Jerusalem are forced to flee the city, for on every side the sanctuary, innocent blood is shed, and the sanctuary itself is defiled. Her feasts are turned into mourning, and her Sabbaths a reproach. Her honor is turned to contempt. With the land and its people beaten down, the king sends out a decree that all shall be one people and give up their customs. The Gentiles, of course, accept this gladly, and tragically there are those in Israel who do the same, sacrificing to idols and profaning the Sabbath. To ensure the thorough effacement of the Jews by forcing them to forget the law and change all their ordinances, the king sends letters throughout the land that direct the inhabitants thusly: that they shall follow customs strange to their land, forbidding burnt offerings and sacrifices and drink offerings in the sanctuary, profaning Sabbaths and feasts, defiling the sanctuary and priests, building altars and sacred precincts and shrines for idols, sacrificing swine and unclean animals, and leaving their sons uncircumcised. In short, making themselves abominable by everything unclean and profane. The penalty for disobeying these commands is death, and to enforce it, he appoints inspectors over all his people and commands the cities of Judah to offer sacrifice, city by city. Many of the people who forsake the law join them, and the evil they do throughout the land forces Israel into hiding in every place of refuge they have. On the 15th day of Kislev, they erect a desolating sacrifice on this altar of burnt offering, and build altars in the surrounding cities of Judah, burning incense at the doors of the houses and in the streets. Anywhere the books of the law and the covenant are found, they tear the books to pieces and burn them, and put to death those who have them or adhere to the law in any way, great or small. But many resolve to die rather than be defiled or profane the covenant, and die they do. Now it is time to meet a very special family, Mattathias, a priest of the sons of Joarib, and his 5 sons, John, surnamed Gadi, Simon called Thasi, Judah called Maccabee, Eleazar called Avarin, and Jonathan called Aphus, who have recently fled Jerusalem and settled in a little town called Modane. Upon seeing the blasphemies being committed in Judah and Jerusalem, he and his sons are in deep mourning, and he speaks thusly.
Alas, why was I born to see this, the ruin of my people? the ruin of the holy city, and to dwell there. But it was given over to the enemy, the sanctuary given over to the aliens. Her temple has become like a man without honor. Her glorious vessels have been carried into captivity. Her babes killed in her streets, her youth by the sword of the foe. What nation has not inherited her palaces and has not seized her spoils? All of her adornment has been taken away, no longer free. She has become a slave. And behold, her holy palace, her beauty, and her glory have been laid waste to Gentiles. The Gentiles have profaned it. Why should we live any longer?
And now, the officers of the king who enforced the apostasy have arrived in Modin to force them to offer sacrifice. As Mattathias and his sons assemble, along with many of those from Israel, the officers seek out a person of influence they can use to persuade the people to go along with the profane sacrifice. Approaching Mattathias, they speak thusly.
You are a leader, honored and great in the city, supported by sons and brothers. Now be the first to come and do what the king commands, as all Gentiles and all men of Judea and those who are left in Jerusalem have done. Then you and your sons will be numbered among the friends of the king, and your sons will be honored with gold and many gifts.
Even if all the nations that live under the king's rule obey him and choose to live by his commands, departing each one from the religion of his fathers, yet I and my sons and my brothers will live by the covenant of our fathers. Far be it from us to desert the law and ordinances. We will not obey the king's words by turning aside from our religion to the right hand or to the left.
As he finishes speaking, a Jew comes forward in the sight of all to sacrifice on the altar in Modin, according to the king's command. Mattathias sees, and his heart stirs within him, and burns with zeal for the law as Pinechas against Zimri ben Salu. Giving vent to righteous anger, he runs forward and kills the Jew at the altar, cuts down the king's officer who is forcing them to sacrifice, and tears the altar down.
Time. Let everyone who is zealous for the law and the covenant come with me.
He and his sons flee into the hills, leaving all that they have in the city. Then many who are seeking righteousness and justice go down into the wilderness to dwell there, they, their sons, their wives, and their cattle, because evils press heavily upon them. And it is reported to the king's officers and the Jerusalem garrison that those who have rejected the king's command have got into hiding places in the wilderness. Having pursued and overtaken them, they encamp across from them and prepare for battle on the Sabbath day.
Enough! Enough of this! Come out and obey the king's command, and you will live.
We will not come out, nor will we obey the king's command, and so profane the Sabbath.
Then the enemy hastens to attack them, but they neither hurl a stone nor block up their hiding places.
Let us die in our innocence. Heaven and earth will testify that you are killing us unjustly.
So they fall, they and their wives and their sons and their cattle. 1,000 perish that day. When Mattathias and his friends learn of it, they mourn for them deeply.
If we do as our brethren have done, and refuse to fight with the Gentiles for our lives and for our ordinances, they will quickly destroy us from the earth. Let us fight against every man who comes to attack us on the Sabbath day. Let us not all die as our brethren died in their hiding places.
They now unite with a company of Hasidians, mighty warriors of Israel, with all who offer themselves willingly for the law, and all who become fugitives to escape the troubles. Organizing an army, they strike down sinners in their anger, and lawless men in their wrath, forcing the survivors to flee to the Gentiles for safety. Hunting down lawless men, they prosper in all that they do, never letting sinners have the upper hand. Now, dear audience, the time has come for Matthias to die. Gathering his sons, he speaks to them.
Arrogance and reproach have now become strong. It is a time of ruin and furious anger. Now, my children, show zeal for the law, and give your lives for the covenant of our fathers. Remember the deeds of the fathers which they did in their generations, and received great honor and everlasting name. Was not Abraham found faithful when tested? And was it not reckoned to him as righteousness? Joseph, in the time of his distress, kept the commandment and became Lord of Egypt. Phineas, our father, because he was deeply zealous for the law, received the covenant of everlasting priesthood. Joshua, because he was faithful to the command, became a judge in all of Israel. Caleb, because he testified in the assembly, received an inheritance of the land. David, because he was merciful, inherited the throne of the kingdom forever. And Elijah, because of his great zeal for the law, was taken up into heaven. Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah believed and were saved from the flame. Daniel, because of his innocence, he was delivered from the mouth of the lion, and so observed from generation to generation that none who put their trust in him will lack strength. Do not fear the words of a sinner, for his splendor will turn into dung and worms. Today we will be exalted, but tomorrow, today he will be exalted, but tomorrow he will not be found, because he has returned to the dust, and his plans will perish. My children, be courageous and grow strong in the law, for by it you will gain honor. Now, behold, I know that Simon, your brother, is wise in counsel. Judah, Maccabeus, Judah, you have been given to be a mighty warrior from your youth. You shall command an army before you and fight the battle against the peoples. You shall rally about you all who observe the law. You shall avenge avenge the wrong done to your people. Pay back the Gentiles in full, and heed what the law commands.
Having blessed them, he is gathered to his fathers and is buried in the tomb of his fathers at Modin, where all Israel mourns for him with great lamentation. Now Judah, called Maccabeus, takes command of the army, and all his brothers and those who joined his father help him, gladly fighting for Israel. He quickly establishes himself as a deadly fighter and a renowned tactician, protecting the host with his sword, pursuing the lawless with a relentless hand, and deliverance prospers by him. Throughout the cities of Judah, the ungodly are destroyed out of the land, and wrath is turned away from Israel. However, a fresh nemesis arises in Apollonius, who gathers Gentiles in a large force from Samaria to fight against Israel. His story is in brief, however, dear audience, for Judah, upon hearing of him, meets him in battle, and Apollonius is cut down on the field as his defeated army flees around him. But this lesson is not yet learned, for Saron, the commander of the Syrian army, has heard of the company Judah has gathered from the faithful.
I will make a name for myself and win honor in the kingdom. I make war on Judah and his companions who scorn the king's command.
Again, a strong army of the ungodly go up with him to take vengeance on the sons of Israel. At the ascent of Beth Horon, Judah and a small company come out to meet them. But reconnaissance of the hostile force leads to doubt among the rebels.
How can we, few as we are, fight against so great and strong a multitude? And we are faint, for we have eaten nothing today.
It is easy for many to be hemmed in by few, for in the sight of heaven there is no difference between saving by many or by few, it is not on the size of the army that victory in battle depends, but the strength comes from heaven. Come against us in great pride and lawlessness, to destroy us and our wives and our children, and to despoil us. But we fight for our lives and for our laws. He himself will crush them before us, and as for you, do not be afraid.
Finished with his exhortation, Judah leads a sudden charge into the Syrian army, crushing all before him. Pursued down the descent of Beit Horon, the survivors onto the plain, the Syrians lose 800 men as the survivors flee to the land of the Philistines. Now the terror of Judah and his brothers falls upon the Gentiles, and talk of their battles and fame reaches the ears of the king. In a rage, Antiochus gathers the entirety of the kingdom's forces, giving them a year's pay and ordering them to be ready for any need. Having done this, however, he discovers that the money in the treasury is gone, and that the revenue is small, since by abolishing the law of days past, he has caused much dissension and disaster upon the land. Great perplexity assails his mind, for he is afraid that he will be unable to support his expenses, and the gifts he is wont to give lavishly, even more so than preceding kings. And he determines to go to Persia and collect the revenues from those regions to raise a large fund. Leaving Lysias in charge of his affairs from the Euphrates to the border of Egypt, he turns over half his troops and the elephants, and gives him charge of his son, and orders about what he wishes done.
As for the residents of Judah and Jerusalem, send a force against them to wipe out and destroy the strength of Israel and the remnant of Jerusalem. Banish the memory of them from the place settled, aliens in all their territory, and distribute their land.
It will be done, my liege.
With the king departed, Lysias chooses Ptolemy, Nicanor, and Gorgias, mighty men among the friends of the king, and sends him to go into the land of Judah and destroy it according to the king's command, with 40,000 infantry and 7,000 cavalry. Having arrived, the entire force encamps in the plain near Emmaus, where they are joined by traders intent on taking the sons of Israel for slaves, and Syrian and Philistine forces. Now Judah and his brothers see that misfortunes increase as the imperial forces encamp in their territory, and word reaches them of the king's command to bring about their final destruction, so they take counsel together.
Let us repair the destruction of our people and fight for our people and the sanctuary.
The congregation goes to Jerusalem to prepare for battle and to pray and ask mercy and protection, but find it a wilderness with the sanctuary trampled down and the sons of foreigners inhabiting the citadel, a lodging place for the Gentiles. Therefore they go to Mizpah, opposite Jerusalem, where they formerly had a place of prayer. Fasting that day, they put on sackcloth and ashes, rending their clothes, and open the book of the law to inquire into those matters about which the Gentiles consult the images of their gods. And they also bring the garments of the priesthood and the first fruits and the tithes, and stir up the Nazarites who have completed their vows, and they cry out to heaven,
What shall we do with these, and where shall we take them? Your sanctuary is trampled down and profane, and your priests mourn in humiliation. And behold, the Gentiles are assembled against us to destroy us, and you know what they plot against us. How will we be able to withstand them if you do not help us?
After this, they sound the trumpets and give a loud shout. After this, Judah appoints leaders of the 1,000, the 100, the 50, and the 10, and sends back to their homes those who are building houses, or are betrothed, or have planted a vineyard, or are faint-hearted, as it is written in the law. With that done, the army marches out and encamps to the south of Emmaus, and Judah addresses the war band.
Gird yourselves and be valiant. Be ready early in the morning to fight with these Gentiles who have assembled against us to destroy us on our sanctuary. It is better to die in battle than to see the misfortunes of our nation in the sanctuary. But as his will in heaven may be, or so will do.
Night falls, and Gorgias takes 5,000 infantry and 1,000 picked cavalry to fall upon the camp of the Jews by night and attack it suddenly, with men from the citadel as his guides. But Judah hears of it, and he and his mighty men move out to attack the king's force in Emmaus while Gorgias' division is still absent the camp. Upon entering the Judean camp by night, Gorgias finds it empty and begins searching the hills, presuming in his arrogance that the Judeans are fleeing from him. Dawn casts its pale light across the countryside, and Judah appears on the plain with 3,000 men, albeit lacking armor and weapons such as they had desired, and they look upon the Gentile camp, strong and fortified, with cavalry round about and trained men of war. Seeing this, Judah addresses his men.
Do not fear their numbers, nor be afraid when they charge. Remember how our fathers have saved us at the Red Sea. When Pharaoh with his forces pursued, he will favor us and remember his covenant with our fathers and crush his army. This army before us. Then all the Gentiles will know that there is one who redeems and saves Israel.
As the rebels advance upon the imperial camp, the sentries rouse the garrison to battle, and the men with Judah blow their trumpets and engage in battle. The Gentiles are crushed before them and flee onto the plain, and all those in the rear fall by the sword.
Do not be greedy.
The pursuit stretches to Gazara and the plains of Idumea, and Azotus and Jamnia, and 3,000 of the imperial forces fall before Judah and his forces turn back from pursuing them.
Do not be greedy for plunder, for there is a battle before us. Goliath and his force are near us in the hills, but stand now against our enemies and fight them. Afterwards, seize their plunder boldly.
No sooner has Judah finished issuing his instructions than a detachment appears out of the hills. Surveying the field, they perceive that the rest of their army has been put to flight, and the camp has been put to the torch. Deadly fear settles upon them, and as they see the Jews drawn up in battle array before them, they flee to the land of the Philistines. Then Judah returns with his men to plunder the camp, and they seize a great and rich spoil from the camp. On their return, they sing hymns and praises to heaven, for he is good, and his mercy endures forever. Thus, Israel has had a great deliverance this day. But Lysias hears of what has happened from the survivors of the rout, and he is perplexed and discouraged, for things have not happened as he expected, nor have they turned out as the king has commanded him. The next year he musters 60,000 picked infantrymen and 5,000 cavalry to subdue them. Coming to Idumea, the imperial army camps at Bethzur, and Judah meets them with 10,000 men. And seeing that the army is strong, he prays thusly.
Blessed are you, O Savior of Israel. You did crush the attack of the mighty war by the hand of your servant David, and you give the camp of the Philistines into the hand of Jonathan, the son of Saul, and of the man who carried his armor. So you him and his army by the hand of your people Israel, and let them be ashamed of their troops and their cavalry. Fill them with cowardice. Melt the fullness of their strength, and let them tremble in their destruction. Strike them down with the sword. For those who love you, and let all who know your name praise you with hymns.
Now both sides attack, and 5,000 men of the imperial army are cut down. And when Lysias sees the rout of his troops and observes the boldness which inspires those of Judah, and how ready they are to either live or die nobly, he departs to Antioch and enlists mercenaries to invade Judea again with an even larger army. Then Judah and his brothers converse among themselves.
Behold, our enemies are crushed. Let us go up to cleanse the sanctuary and dedicate it.
So all the army assembles and goes up to Mount Zion. And when they arrive, they see the sanctuary desolate, the altar profaned, and the gates burned. Bushes have sprung up as in a thicket, and the chambers of the priests are in ruins. Rending their clothes, they mourn with great lamentation, and sprinkle themselves with ashes. Falling face down on the ground, they sound the signal on the trumpets, and cry out to heaven. Then Judah details men to fight against those in the citadel until the sanctuary is cleansed. Choosing blameless priests devoted to the law, they cleanse the sanctuary and remove the defiled stones to an unclean place. Having deliberated about the altar of burnt offering, which has been profaned, they decide to tear it down lest it bring reproach upon them, for the Gentiles had defiled it. So they tear down the altar and store the stones in a convenient place on the temple hill until there should come a prophet to tell them what to do with them. That done, they take unhewn stones as the law directs and build an altar like unto the former one. Rebuilding the sanctuary and temple interior and consecrating the courts, they make new holy vessels and bring the lampstand, the altar of incense, and the table into the temple. Placing the bread upon the table and hanging new curtains, they complete the work they have done. Early in the morning on the 25th day of the 9th month, the month of Kislev, they arise and offer sacrifice as the law directs on the new altar of burnt offering which they built. At the very season and on the very day that the Gentiles had profaned it, the temple is dedicated with songs and harps and lutes and cymbals. All the people fall on their faces and worship and bless heaven, who has prospered them. So they celebrate the dedication of the altar for 8 days and offer burnt offerings with gladness, offering a sacrifice of deliverance and praise. Decorating the front of the temple with golden crowns and small shields, they restore the gates and the chambers of the priests and furnish them with gold. Great gladness pervades the people, and the reproach of the Gentiles is removed. Then Judah and all his brothers and the assembly of Israel determined that every year at this season, the days of dedication of the altar shall be observed with gladness and joy for 8 days, beginning with the 25th day of the month of Kislev. As we light the lights, I look at them and remember that no matter how dark things get, there will always be a light in this darkness.